Party will certainly not be supporting this bill, which will strip Television New Zealand of any public service functions, of any public service obligations or responsibilities, and turn it into a nakedly commercial broadcaster, in the Minister's words, indistinguishable from any other public or commercial broadcaster in New Zealand. And it is indeed a sad day to sit here and watch one of the last remaining public service broadcasters disappear, because that is what this bill will do, and particularly sad when we consider the media landscape in New Zealand. New Zealand has one of the most deregulated broadcasting environments in the world, certainly the Western world, probably the most deregulated. We've got no laws limiting cross-media ownership, no regulations restricting the amount of foreign ownership of the media, as a result of which only a handful of media outlets in New Zealand are not foreign owned. The Otago Daily Times, a couple of papers on the West Coast, Radio New Zealand, TVNZ and Maori Television. We're one of the only countries in the world which has no local content quotas, and as a result we have the lowest amount of local programming on television of any OECD country. Most of Europe has local content, in about 90% local content. Australia is one of the lowest, with only 55% mandatory local content. New Zealand, well, on TV2 we've got 10 to 20% local content, and rapidly diminishing local content on TV2. And of course, once this bill goes through, we will be the only country in the OECD that doesn't have a public service television broadcaster, and soon, no doubt, we'll be the first country in the world to sell our public service television broadcaster, because obviously that is the hidden agenda here, to ready TVNZ for sale. For why otherwise? I mean, what is the point otherwise in having a publicly owned broadcaster that has no public service functions or no public service responsibilities whatsoever? So what this bill does, as others have pointed out, is strip TVNZ of its charter and all its public broadcasting responsibilities and any pretence of having any. Now, the Green Party is the first to admit that the previous dual mandate of TVNZ was not a great success, but at least the Charter spelled out explicitly and unequivocally that Television New Zealand was expected to be a public service broadcaster, to serve the public interest, to have high quality news and current affairs, and it set out a list of programming that it was expected to have, such as drama, children's programming and so forth. All of this has gone exist to be nakedly commercial, focused solely on pursuing ratings, pursuing advertising revenue. Essentially, it exists to sell audiences to advertisers. Once the bill goes through this Parliament, as it undoubtedly will, it will exist for the sole purpose of returning a profit and a 9% dividend to its shareholder, the government. The board already has a mandate of returning a dividend at all costs, and it's looking at ways of lifting its profits by 30 to 40 million. When you consider there was a 90% drop in profits last year and a $17 million fall in advertising revenue. But with no charter in place and absolutely no requirements to screen any particular programs, TVNZ will be able to do whatever it wishes to try to lift its profits by 30 or 40 million. It will have, as the Minister said, complete flexibility to do whatever it wants, no requirement for TVNZ to screen local programs, no requirement to screen documentaries or dramas or children's programs or minority interest programs. Inevitably, therefore, we will see even fewer New Zealand programs, less and less news and current affairs, probably won't see any documentaries, because these programs are more expensive to produce. It is more expensive to produce New Zealand programs than it is to import cheap, packaged action programs and so forth from overseas. So we'll see less and less current affairs and news, less and less of New Zealand content, and already this is happening. Its budget by 25 million. It made 90 staff redundant. It cut 100 hours of local programming. This year they're talking of making a further 75 staff redundant around June, I'm told. They're making savage cuts to news and current affairs, cutting 12.5% from the $40 million news budget. And they're talking even about reducing TVNZ News to half an hour and downgrading the Wellington and Christchurch news offices and centralising control in Auckland. So soon we'll have the Auckland news, not the New Zealand news. Now, obviously this is an idiotic strategy, because the 1 hour, the 6 to 7 hour is considered the flagship hour, that news hour, when channels compete for audience share. So by slashing the news budget, as they're proposing to do, inevitably that will reduce the quality of news, and therefore people will migrate to other channels such as TV3, and they'll lose audience share and therefore advertising and therefore revenue. So it's an idiotic strategy. But even leaving that aside, this reduction in the news and current affairs which we're seeing, and in New Zealand programming, is an inevitable consequence of stripping TVNZ of its public service charter and just saying it should be solely focused on naked commercialism. And what we're really seeing is a return to the commercial excesses of the 1990s. This is what the government did in the 1990s, and really this is just a rerun. New Zealand solely focused on maximising returns and dividends and preparing TVNZ for sale. So really it's finishing the unfinished business, because in the 1990s the intention was to prepare TVNZ for sale, but it didn't succeed in doing it then, so clearly it's out to finish that unfinished agenda. Although I must admit there is a problem, and the Minister has spoken about this in an interview. He said the only problem is there are unlikely to be any buyers out there. The value of TVNZ has dropped from 330 million to 184 million, and he said, well, if you look at that, what the equity has done, nobody would want to buy it. Well, the question that media commentators are asking is, other than stripping TVNZ of its charter and its charter funding, and starving Radio New Zealand of its funding, what is the government's broadcasting strategy? The media commentator John Drinnan said, barely a year on the job, Mr Coleman has created such a muddle, I repeat, such a muddle, that it's impossible to discern the direction of the key government's broadcasting policy, if indeed it has one. And the closest thing I found to the Minister discussing his strategy, in an interview he said, now that TV1 and 2 are nakedly, people will be able to turn to TV6 and 7, the new public service channels, to get what he said most people would describe as quality broadcasting content, and then if they flick to TV1 and 2 they would get whatever they serve up. Now, TVNZ is basically, it is not a public service broadcasting channel with high quality programming. It's a niche channel. It basically delivers news, update, repeats from TV1, handful of local shows, basically just reruns, can't call it quality broadcasting, and by 2012 it will have no more money. The Minister has said its funding runs out. There will be no more money. They will expect TVNZ to fund it, and TVNZ has made it plain they will not be funding it. So the truth is there is no broadcasting strategy.